Hi everybody, welcome back to CLCV 231, Development of Ancient Cities. This is the fifth lecture of the course, and we will be talking about the early city-states at the beginning of the Bronze Age in Mesopotamia. We'll be looking at some examples of alternatives to the Mesopotamian template for urbanism, and then at the end of the lectures, we will be looking at some of the empires of the Bronze Age. So here's a little more detail for that. So I'm going to talk through the sort of classic Sumerian city-states of southern Mesopotamia, particularly the cities of Uruk and Ur. We're going to look at a thing called the Uruk expansion, where we see this South Mesopotamian style city type spread across Mesopotamia. And then we're going to switch focus a little bit and look at a couple of examples from the end of the Neolithic, the very beginning of the Bronze Age, where it seems like people resisted authority and some of the early features of urbanism, and how those differ from what we see in these classic Sumerian city-states of southern Mesopotamia. And then we're going to look at some examples of other states where their cities and the way they work don't really fit into this Mesopotamian mold. And in particular, that's going to be Egypt. Then we will come back to the next big development of urban life in Mesopotamia, which are the empires of the Mesopotamian Bronze Age. And then at the very end, we'll think a little bit more broadly about this relationship between states and cities before we move on in time and place in Lecture 6 into the Aegean and look further west in the Mediterranean during the Bronze Age. So last time, we started talking about the beginnings of what some scholars call pristine states, the very first states, really organized, centralized forms of government over extensive numbers of people that we can see. And these, for our purposes for this class, these happen first in Mesopotamia at the end of the 4th millennium BC, where even though we saw the earliest city that we can date in southern Mesopotamia at Eridu, where we really start to see an organized government and state, is late in the 4th millennium in the city of Uruk. Uruk is a type site. If you remember that piece of vocabulary, it gives its name to a specific culture. And this is, in many ways, the first of these, what we call pristine states, which, used both the amazing agricultural potential of southern Mesopotamia, and which seems to have slightly later established a system, what may be a system of colonies up the Euphrates River that could send back surplus tribute for the city-states of southern Mesopotamia. There is plenty of debate about whether this was actually a formalized system of colonies, whether this was what we might call an economic empire, whether there might be cultural and religious and material culture just adopted by cultures in northern Mesopotamia, or whether it's some combination of these possibilities. What we do see in southern Mesopotamia is an economy based on the massive agricultural surpluses that the intensive irrigation-driven agriculture that we talked about last time, and which I'll review a little this time, brought about, and also wealth based on massive herds of state or temple-owned livestock. This is the so-called urban revolution that the Gordon Child talked about, and which, again, is an idea under, constant reconsideration. And then these first city-states in the Uruk period in southern Mesopotamia really, kind of set the stage for the millennia to follow, and the many states and empires that based themselves in Mesopotamia in the following 3,000 years. So, in the Mediterranean region, we also see a pristine state beginning just a little bit later in Egypt. This seems to be a result of sort of expanding chiefdoms and that idea of chiefly cycling, of competition between neighboring chiefdoms, both peaceful and not peaceful, that eventually resulted in the unification of the entire territory of Egypt very early on. And the beginnings of what we can first call a territorial state. So this is a thing that we will look at more closely in coming, later on in the lecture, in coming slides. But we, I do want to point out that we have these two, not really competing, but these diverging models of how cities and governments interact with each other. So I'll let you guys review this yourself rather than just talking through it. But, is your state based on a city and its territory, as we see being sort of the default in Mesopotamia, or in Egypt, where really the control of large areas of territory happened before the development of many of the other characteristics of complex states that we see at the city level in Mesopotamia. Both of these possibilities have specific implications for the development of cities in these kinds of states. So, one of these two, early city-states is the type site of Ur. It is today called Warka. It is probably the city named in the Hebrew scriptures as Erech. And this is the city that is the focus of the very early, the Bronze Age epic, the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the king that involves the adventures of Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk. In the first part of them, his sidekick, essentially, Enki, and run-ins with various monsters and deities, most famously the goddess Inanna, the death of Enki, and then Gilgamesh's ultimately unsuccessful quest for eternal life, and the his eventual realization and growth in wisdom that means that he doesn't really need to live forever. In Uruk, the part that is best known is the religious center of the settlement. What's called the Aeana precinct, what are called the Aeana precinct and the Anu ziggurat. These are in here. As with so many important urban centers in around the world, the first archaeologists to look at this site were far more interested in the more durable, more aesthetically compelling, more politically and artistically fruitful areas of the city, such as the the religious center of Uruk, where things like the Anu Ziggurat, which would have had a temple on top of it. Remember that the ziggurat is just the platform, the artificial mountain to elevate a temple above its surrounding city. The White Temple would have been on top of the Anu Ziggurat. These areas were of much greater interest to the early archaeologists of the 19th and early 20th century than the areas within the city walls or just outside of the city walls where more of the ordinary everyday people would have lived, and which archaeologists today have been investigating to find out more of how the normal citizens of these cities would have spent their days. The other sort of textbook site for the early urbanism of southern Mesopotamia is the site of Ur, what is modernly called Tel al-Mukyar. On the far left, we have a plan of Ur drawn around 2012, so relatively recent, and then an artist's reconstruction of the city itself that highlights, how this would have interacted with the surrounding landscape, the walled harbors, its relationship with various branches of the Euphrates River, and then up at the top is a view of part of the site as is visible today. The remains of the ziggurat at Ur, which is 11 on the site plan. And if you're interested in what all of these different areas are, the full key for the site plan is in the notes for this slide. The ziggurat at Ur, you see back here, looks in surprisingly good shape. This was heavily rebuilt during the 1980s, during the reign of Saddam Hussein. And, this is just a point where we can point out how important the perception of the ancient world, how important cultural heritage can be for good and for ill. As Saddam Hussein, as with many world leaders, wanted to tie the power of his regime back to these earliest indications of political and economic power and complexity in the region. So, at its largest, Uruk seems to have covered an area of about 400 hectares, and by about 3,100, seems to have had a population of around 40,000 people. This would have made it one of the largest cities in the world at this time, if not the largest city in the world. So, we need to consider that alongside the intense urbanization of these early cities of southern Mesopotamia, like Ur and Uruk, was a comparable ruralization of the countryside. And by 2500 BC, at the height of urbanism in southern Mesopotamia, it's estimated that about 80% of the population of this region lived in settlements with areas of at least 60 hectares. So things that were at least towns, if not full-fledged cities, much less, what passed as a megacity for the time, like Uruk. So, we've already discussed a bit of the importance of the natural environment of southern Mesopotamia, its incredible agricultural potential that is controlled and enhanced by human irrigation and the digging of irrigation systems throughout southern Mesopotamia surrounding these cities. And this ability to accumulate agricultural surpluses is what really sits at the bedrock of the incredible prosperity of southern Mesopotamia at the time. Alongside this agriculture, we have to consider the sort of third leg of this region, which is the marshes themselves. So this area around, especially around Ur and Uruk, if you remember in earlier classes, I've discussed how the coast of the Persian Gulf would have been much further north than it is today due to the accumulation of silt from the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Ur and Uruk would have been very close to the coast in this extremely fertile brackish marshland. And the products of those marshes themselves, such as dried fish, which is a source of protein that can be, fish, a source of protein that can be dried and therefore stored and then redistributed, which would assist with forming hierarchies. But also things like reeds that would have been fodder for livestock, and also, as I mentioned in the last lecture, which would have been an important building material. These are the natural resources of these marshes would have been what some scholars have called the third leg, alongside agriculture and animal husbandry, for the economy, the incredible economic power, and therefore also the incredible political power of southern Mesopotamia in this period. So, one of the ways that scholars have been able to really learn more about the ancient agriculture and how land was managed, how water was managed, how irrigation was put into place, actually comes from recently declassified satellite images from the 1960s through 1980s, the Corona and Keyhole projects. If you're interested in, things done by the NSA, that, alongside, being military spy satellites, also actually captured traces of ancient watercourses, both natural and human-made, that indicate that the Tigris and Euphrates, beginning in the 3rd millennium BC, formed this dynamic network of spreading and branching and changing watercourses that were then augmented by human dug irrigation channels in the 4th millennium. And this would have greatly enlarged the areas that could be supported, that could support agriculture, that could support herding. And this is all, in contrast to the areas to the north that were dependent on rainfall for agricultural subsistence. So this slide shows some of these ancient irrigation channels that can be picked up by these satellites. This is another image that shows on a much wider scale. If you see here, these are the channels. Here's some of them. These light areas, especially down here, adjacent to them are the remains of essentially ancient dredging. And then this is formerly alluvial area. So what had been river fed over the course of millennia, but because the Tigris and Euphrates, especially before the advent of modern water management systems after World War II, because these rivers changed course dynamically and really quite unpredictably in some cases. This is now desert, and this area down here to the southwest is the currently watered course of the Euphrates River. So, this period, however, was all the very end of the Neolithic, the very beginning of the Bronze Age. Also, was a relatively clement, a relatively well-watered period for Mesopotamia. And in fact, we have indications that there would have been precipitation in the summer, which never happens today. Rain is a purely winter and early spring phenomenon in this part of the world. This too, alongside the irrigation, would have allowed for better grazing for animals and also the domestication and cultivation of date palms. So this over here is a photograph of what dates look like while they are still on the palm tree, and then we can see in one of the early dynastic, early Bronze Age works of art from the royal tombs of Ur, the tomb of Queen Puabi, or sometimes she's called Shubad, Queen Puabi of Ur, who was buried around 2600 BC. We can see these indications of dates. So these are dates here on their branches. These are other agricultural products. I think they are I think they might be the flowers of male date trees, that send out the pollen. And then we have also some kinds of fruit. And these are part of a set of necklaces that were buried with this in this incredibly wealthy burial for this early dynastic, early Bronze Age queen. And you can see these other necklaces that were buried with her that not only have agricultural products on them, dates and other produce, but also these tiny figurines of animals, goats and sheep and bulls, which were also on the animal end of things at the core of Mesopotamian prosperity. So just to kind of once again highlight the importance of animals, we've got throughout Mesopotamia and Egypt, which we'll talk about a bit later, some of some indications of the importance of the domestication of animals. For Mesopotamia, the most important being sheep, but also growing in importance in this period, donkeys, which seem to have first been domesticated around 5000 BC, probably somewhere in East Africa. So south of Egypt. So the area that was historically called Nubia, possibly possibly further to the east in what is now the highlands of Ethiopia. Our earliest known images of domesticated donkeys come from actually this particular work of art, a kind of two-sided relief in the shape of a makeup palette, a large votive makeup palette that they're just called palettes. This is called the Libyan palette. It's a fragment of what would have been a larger work of art. It was found at Abydos in Egypt. It's dated to about 3200 BC, so the very early in the dynastic history of Egypt. And it shows almost a hierarchy of different, kinds of production. So we've got, trees and growing things down here. We have sheep here. We have donkeys in the middle, which are relatively recently domesticated, and then we have cattle up top. And we'll see similar hierarchies in Mesopotamian art from this period. This is a chariot, and a bronze figurine of a chariot from northern Mesopotamia, a place called Tel Agrab, from a little bit later, with a chariot pulled by donkeys. We have mighty war donkeys in Egypt and Mesopotamia in this period, before horses were used widely in the region. And so donkeys were the most important transport animal at this time, and sheep were the foundation of an economy based largely on textiles, agricultural surplus, and finely woven wool textiles that were traded widely across the region in this period. And this is a drawing of a cylinder seal impression that shows weaving. So this is a loom that was probably staked out on the ground, seen from the top. We've got two little figures here, kneeling to either side of the loom, and they are also shown from above, and then figures standing to either side. There's multiple perspectives going on in this image to make it as readable as possible. Okay, so back to Uruk. Already mentioned, this is a type site that gives its name to the period. All right, so we're going to look a little more closely at some of the ceremonial centers of the city. And in this part of the lecture, I want you guys to think about a city as being both a physical reality. So we've got a physical city, temples, irrigation, palaces, houses, objects. There is also an ideological city, a city that is composed of symbols and ideas, and what people, how cities live in people's minds, as well as the things that you can stub your toe on. So, this is one of the most important religious parts of the city of Uruk. Here's the ziggurat, and this is a plan that shows a couple of different phases of this part of the city. So this is from the late Uruk period, and the brief period after it, which is called the Jemdet Nasser period. Jemdet Nasser is also named for a type site, and the archaeologists have laid this out in a couple of colors. So we've got level 4B in blue and level 4A in green. So we have new building material. We have new buildings, the buildings of level 4A replacing the buildings of level 4B, and sitting over top of them, as you can see, especially here, where the square building has been lain over top with Temple D. And this is a period where we start to see new building materials, still mud brick, but mud brick that is standardized and reduced in size. So if you guys remember from the last lecture, I talked about these mud bricks that were essentially looked like giant cigars of dried clay, that, could be, what we would consider several feet long, almost a meter long by 2/3 of a meter, in diameter. They're unwieldy. Making smaller bricks makes it much easier for one person to handle them. And so you don't have to work in teams. It also helps them dry more evenly. So this is where we start to see standardized building materials used in the construction of cities. This is another detail of these important religious areas in Uruk in what's called the Aeana Precinct. A precinct is an organized religious area that's usually marked out by some sort of wall. So here in the Aeana Precinct, in these levels, so levels 5 and 4B, the Uruk period, and the middle and late Uruk periods, we see other things going on. We see other innovations in building. So in addition to these temples, so this is the temple on the north-south terrace, which continues to have this tripartite plan that we saw, early on in the construction of religious architecture, like we saw at Eridu. And then here, the limestone temple, which is a different material. It's not mud brick, it's limestone, but which follows the same plan, with this T-shaped central hallway and two sort of banks of rooms, making the three parts of the tripartite temple, combined with that T-shaped plan. So continuing these patterns that we saw last time. What's innovative here are these details we'll look at in the next slide. One is the use of freestanding columns. So we have this columned hall here, and the characteristic Sumerian decorative method of architectural decoration, which is called cone mosaic. So this is another plan of that pillared hall, and the open courtyard next to it, and the temple right next to that. And these are some of the mud brick columns that we haven't seen before now. So freestanding columns, except for those very, very early stone columns at Göbekli Tepe, are not a thing that we've really seen so far. And in Mesopotamia, those were made out of mud brick, and then they would be covered with a thick layer of mud plaster, and these colored cones of clay would be set into that wet mud plaster and used to make these, decorative patterns. And here at C, the walls of this courtyard were in fact entirely decorated with these cone mosaics, as well as the columns. So here's some color images. So this is these are columns with the cone mosaic decoration that we'll actually see. These are not from Uruk, but they're one of the best surviving examples. We'll talk about them more later. These are some of the clay cones from the Aeana Precinct, and here are some from the archaeological context. All right, so let's look at some slightly later things. All right, so I've already mentioned several times this combination of T-shaped temples or T-shaped plans and tripartite temples. Both of these, Temple D and Temple C, also combine those two temple forms. So the ziggurat from Uruk is like the ziggurat from Eridu, is a amalgamation, a layer cake of earlier platforms and earlier temples built one on top of the other. As I mentioned before, so this is a thing that was added to and built and rebuilt and made larger over the course of many hundreds of years. As I mentioned before, the ziggurat, which is probably the most famous Mesopotamian architectural thing, is actually just the platform for the temple. The temple was a separate building on top. So this is the White Temple at Uruk on top of the Anu Ziggurat. And this is a reconstruction drawing of what that may have looked like from the outside. It's called the White Temple because it was covered with plaster. And then here are some other drawings. It's a plan, what it would look like from the top. Something more three-dimensional to give you a better idea of just how imposing and just how massive that those ziggurats were. This is a relatively simple one. Early on, it's a lot less symmetrical, a lot less formalized than the ziggurat at Ur, which is slightly later. So these would have had sets of stairs, not just the temple itself, but also open courtyards for large-scale rituals, and then the temple area itself. And once again, we can compare the plan from level 7 at Eridu, just about 1,000 years earlier than the Jemdet Nasser period temple at Uruk. And this is what it looked like inside, or what it looked like inside while people were excavating. This is the offering table here in the middle. We've got these deeply articulated, receding and projecting facades that, really enliven the interior. And interestingly, the remains of a leopard and a young lion were found buried in the east corner. If you remember, the corners of temples are what the Sumerians oriented toward cardinal directions, not the walls themselves. And in the east corner were found a ritual deposit of the skeletons of a leopard and a young lion that may have something to do with the foundation of the temple. So, not all architecture in Mesopotamian city-states was, of course, this kind of massive, monumental, religious or, religious or political construction. Most houses, most people live in pretty ordinary houses. And even though we do not know as much about the houses of ordinary people in the early city-states of Mesopotamia, I want to at least show you some of what we do know, because houses are important. And this is not just a matter of basic curiosity, because it's interesting to know how people lived in the past, but because the developments of households, the sort of social arrangements that people base their lives around are very often at the core of how people think about governments and how people think about religion. So, and in fact, some scholars have argued that urbanism itself, this is a scholar named Schloen, writing in 2001, argued that urbanism itself may have been the unintended result of a shift in the social definition of the household from a small domestic group to a more flexible and metaphorical definition of a household that could include larger communities, cities, or entire kingdoms. And the relationship, this has a bearing on the relationship between cities and deities, or cities and their political elite, because these were essentially at the beginning households writ large. The temple was the house of a deity, the city was their estate, and the people attached to the temple were their, the members of their household. The the king was, especially very early on, considered to be in many ways a manager or overseer for the god, who was, in fact, the actual ruler of the city. So if we understand, houses and households better, it can give us a better understanding of the organization of these cities, not just physically, in terms of like, well, here's a house, here's a house, here's a house, but also in terms of like how authority worked in these early city states. So this is a slightly later terracotta model of a house from the area of the later city-state of Babylon. And here we can see it's 2 stories. It is, you can see the different patterns on it. We're not sure if this is decoration or indications of different kinds of construction materials. Perhaps, a stone foundation and a mud brick or wattle and daub superstructure. We've got the ends of beams here holding up the roof and holding up the second story. And, a hole right here in what would have probably been a sort of internal courtyard or internal central room to let out smoke from a central hearth. We do, kind of amazingly, have again a slightly later, this is from around 2000 BC, we have a clay tablet with the floor plan of a house with a central courtyard. This is from the ancient city of Umma, which now Tel Joka in Iraq. And, like this, we can see this sort of central space. We have one opening from the street. We have a couple of areas that seem to be slightly segregated from the rest of the house. This probably was 2 stories. It's at least conjectured that these kinds of houses were 2 stories. And then a central, this central space that probably would have been at least partially open to the sky. And this is another image, reconstruction of the houses from Ur. Some ordinary houses were excavated in Ur in the 1960s, and this is one of these slightly conjectural reconstructions of those houses themselves. So in the Uruk period, we start to really see widespread trade between Mesopotamia and far-flung outlying civilizations. So in the case of Egypt, we see Mesopotamia acting as a conduit for things from for luxury goods, stones like carnelian and lapis lazuli, which would have needed to come from the Indian subcontinent and northern Afghanistan, respectively. You can see that here. We also see interesting adoptions and hybridizations of the iconography from these different cultures. Here, number 2, which has 2 different images, is an object called the Gebel El Arak knife. This was found in Egypt but and is it's a knife with a flint blade and an ivory handle. So material that would have been traded from Egypt. This is either hippopotamus or elephant ivory, both of which are native to Africa. But the iconography on this knife shows both Egyptian and Mesopotamian influences, and I'm just going to point out one part of that here. This on this side of the knife is this very prominent motif that's sometimes called the Master of Animals motif, that was in fact common to both cultures, both ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. And it shows a figure of authority, and in this case it is very much a southern Mesopotamian ruler, which you can tell from the beard and this funny little this cap with the funny little rolled brim, and the skirt here. And he is fighting two animals at the same time. In this case, two gigantic lions. He's got his each hand on the throat of these big lions, and he's controlling them like that. We also see Egyptian material coming the other direction. So number 3 is one of those cosmetic palettes. This was found in the Levant late in the 4th millennium. And it is not one of the monumental, elaborately decorated palettes as political statements, like the palette of Narmer that I showed back at the beginning of the lecture, but instead is much more of an everyday use sort of item, and it's in the shape of a fish, which is, just a very charming and engaging sort of object. We also see not just trade to the west and south with Egypt. We also see trade far to the east, and in trade trade between Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley civilization, which I will talk about a bit more at the end of the lecture, which is the first urbanized society of the Indian subcontinent, and which really is not nearly as far away as it seems like it should be. It seems like it should be to those of us in the sort of Anglo-American mindset. This is the southeastern corner of the Arabian Peninsula. This is the inlet of the Persian Gulf, the Straits of Hormuz, and the farthest westward outpost of the Indus Valley civilization is actually, right here, just past the Straits of Hormuz, right on the border of what is today Iran and Pakistan. So this civilization, based around the valley of the Indus River and its major tributaries, and then which extended farther south and east along the coast into the Indian subcontinent, the main part of the Indian subcontinent, extended up to the edge of the foothills of the Himalayas, and down the length of the Indus River, and it produced its own fascinating and extremely rich civilization that is in many ways roughly contemporary with the civilizations we're going to be we're talking about in this lecture, and in the lecture centering around later in the Bronze Age to come. So here too, we have influence in trade going in either direction. So we have a seal from the Indus Valley civilization, sometimes called the Gilgamesh seal, with another one of these Master of Animals motifs. Interestingly, here it is very clearly, you can see the stripes. These are very clearly tigers instead of lions. So translating to the great and threatening feline of this part of the world. We also find things like these etched carnelian beads that were found in the royal cemetery of the first dynasty of Ur, and which were probably imported from the Indus Valley. We find these etched carnelian beads not just at Ur, but also in early dynastic and pre-dynastic contexts in Egypt also. So this trade went in many directions, and we see cultural influence in many directions. So those are the physical parts of the cities that are worth considering at this point. At this point, I want to turn to what I'm calling the ideological city. These ideas and images and technologies that go along with the physical parts of the city and really kind of make their own important contribution to urbanism itself. So I've talked about seals a couple of times so far. These very early, late Neolithic, Halaf and Ubaid period stamp seals in particular. But this is, the period where we start to see the need for record keeping become more complicated, more administratively complex, and where we start to see the beginnings of writing. So this is one of the early precursors of writing, not just stamps, but also what are called clay bullae. A bulla is a round ball-like object. And these essentially are very early contracts. So if seals are one of these very early record-keeping systems, the other sort of early record-keeping system are tokens, little tiny clay objects made to look like the objects that you are trading. And those too can be ways of keeping records. How many bushels of grain did we buy from this guy last year? Well, we have 6 or 7 we have 6 tokens. Clearly we bought 6 bushels of grain. This can then be sealed, essentially. You put all the little tokens in a clay envelope, and then all of the parties involved roll their cylinder seal across it, like this cylinder seal with a herd of cows from the Uruk period in Mesopotamia. You roll your cylinder seal across it, and then that contract is sealed. And if there's any question about how many bushels of grain or head of sheep or whatever you traded for, you can break the contract literally, and open the bulla and count these little tokens, and they should match, and ideally you'd break it at the same time in each other's presence to show there's been no tampering. So it seems like one of the pathways towards writing is that not only did people seal these bullae, but eventually they started also impressing little drawings of the tokens inside so that you could check it without breaking the bulla. And eventually people realized, well, if we've got the symbols on the outside and we can check it against each other with the seals, we don't really need to have the tokens inside the contract. We can just use the representations. So this is one of the points where writing really becomes a possibility. Now, this is not an overnight thing. We really don't see the first sort of actual in things that are inscriptions or things that are writing rather than tallying until a bit later in the Uruk period, somewhere somewhere in the late 3000s BC. So 3500, 3300. It is about the same time that hieroglyphics develop in Egypt. And it seems that the idea, perhaps, of writing things down and this kind of representation may have been transmitted from Mesopotamia to Egypt, but that the actual writing systems of hieroglyphics and what I will show you in the next couple of slides, cuneiform, the writing system of Mesopotamia, seem to have developed almost simultaneously in these two regions. So we see in this period seals becoming extremely important in their own right, not just for the protection of private property. We've already in the last lecture talked a bit about sealing jars and doors against obvious tampering. But with the development of these token-based contracts, we also see seals develop into legal transactions, sort of the equivalent of our signature. And they, this use of seals and sealing carries on well past this period in Mesopotamia, and we see these traditions of seals as the guarantors of the legality of documents well into the early modern period in Europe, and other traditions that continue elsewhere in the world. Seals, because they protect private property, seals also then can become a stand-in for the person and be associated with protection of an individual. So it's not so the seal isn't just a marker of a person's agreement or presence. It's also in many ways a stand-in for the person themselves, and then can be used in rituals for the protection of a person against physical harm such as illness, or spiritual harm such as the evil eye and jealousy or curses. So seals took on many different realms of cultural importance in first here in Mesopotamia and the ancient Near East, but also are a thing that we will see used in multiple ways and continuing in these sorts of ways across the ancient Mediterranean and beyond. For modern scholars today, the images on seals and eventually after the development of cuneiform, the inscriptions on seals give us huge amounts of information about many aspects of culture and religion and social relations and economics. We have some seals that can be tracked through time and space. Seals that we can find the sealings, the seal impressions in documents in multiple cities, or we can see seals used across generations, because sometimes these would be inherited. And so we find, a seal that has an inscription with somebody's name on it, or that references something that happened in, I don't know, let me just pick a number, 2000 BC. And then we can also see that seal used even, a couple of centuries later, presumably by a member of the same family, or just by someone else who, bought or inherited that seal and continued to use it, even though it was, an antique. So it seems that the real development of writing comes out of these practices of record keeping and accounting that are associated with the real sort of coalescence of cities in southern Mesopotamia. We start to see in the Uruk period the use of proto-cuneiform, or pre-cuneiform, which are pictographs, or sometimes called logographs or ideograms, where it's an image that stands in for an object or an idea or a thing. So we've got, this pre-cuneiform tag with a drawing of a little animal, goat or a sheep, and a number. Numerical systems also developed around this time, if it makes sense for record keeping. This seems to record food rations that was found in dumps of old cuneiform tablets around the White Temple at Uruk. And then we start to, again, late in the 4th millennium, start to see like the beginnings of these signs being used not just for, for individual objects or ideas. We start to see them being associated with sounds. And this is where things really start to transform into cuneiform from these earlier pre-cuneiform systems of record keeping. So this tablet, this limestone tablet, is thought to be a list of the names of enslaved people. And I'll talk a bit more about the role of enslaved people in the economies of the ancient Near East in a bit in this lecture. But these are signs that seem to represent the names of these enslaved people. So what we see with cuneiform is that it develops a lot over time. This system of writing was in use for almost 3,000 years, from its earliest proto-cuneiform inscriptions, let's say around 3,400 BC, until the very last cuneiform documents were written around 300 BC. We see this writing system change quite a bit. So the earliest forms of cuneiform are, these pictograms. They get the first major change we see is just a turn, a 90-degree turn of the pictograms to make it easier to write these on clay tablets without smearing the images you've already created as you write. And then we start to see abstraction. We start to see these basic pictograms become essentially like series of little wedge-shaped indentations in clay tablets that are very quick and very easy to just tap into the clay with a wedge-shaped stylus. And it's these little wedges that give the system of writing its name. Kuneos is a Greek word meaning cone-shaped or wedge-shaped, and it's these little wedges, little cones, that give it the name cuneiform. So it is important to keep in mind, and this is a thing that students misunderstand every time I teach this, cuneiform is a writing system, not a language. Just like an alphabet is a writing system, not a language. Very quickly in its development, cuneiform started to use those ideograms, those pictures of what the records were, and associate them with sounds, not the phonemes, not the individual sounds that we base our alphabet on, so a, b, k, etc. But whole syllables, so ab, or bet, or gear, or pick any single syllable you like. Now, this is one of the reasons why writing before the use of alphabets was much, much more restricted. It's simply much more difficult to learn a syllabary than it is to learn an alphabet. Alphabets were not developed until the end of the Bronze Age. We've got 2,000 years and some change to go before there is alphabetic writing. So these are, it only takes a few dozen signs to represent all of the sounds in most languages. So most alphabets are made up of somewhere between 18 and 36 characters. Cuneiform and other syllabic writing systems have to have signs for several hundred syllables usually. Most languages have somewhere in the low hundreds of syllables. Cuneiform also uses other kinds of signs. It is technically a logosyllabic writing system, not just a syllabic writing system. So it uses a variety of other signs to kind of determine between words that might sound similar what it's actually talking about. So if you have, say, I don't know, okay, here's some things that sound alike in English. Bear, the animal, bear, the verb, so to carry, and berry, the food. If you were trying to express those things that sound very similar in a logosyllabic language, especially, or a logosyllabic writing system, I make this mistake too, logosyllabic writing system, you may just have that one syllable, bear, that you write down, and then you might have a little sign like animal bear for bear, the animal, or bear verb for to carry, or bear food for what we would call a berry. So this is another challenge in learning to write in cuneiform. So that said, cuneiform texts have been found in 15 languages, and cuneiform was in many ways the diplomatic, the mode of diplomatic correspondence for thousands of years. We've found cuneiform texts all over the Eastern Mediterranean, all over the ancient Near East. There have been archives of cuneiform texts found in Egypt, recording diplomatic correspondence between the rulers and officials of Bronze Age empires. And it was used as a religious recording system well into the well past the time of the great empires of the Bronze Age. So for about 3,000 years. And the last known cuneiform inscription, which was an astronomical text, seems to have been written around 75 A.D. So this is a writing system with a very long history. And if this is something you are interested in, if you are interested in discovering new writing from the ancient world, cuneiform is the way to go. Go become an Assyriologist and start translating the incredible number of cuneiform documents that have been excavated and are known somewhere, depending on who you talk to, between 500,000 and 2 million cuneiform documents have been excavated, but only a small fraction of those have been read or published. So there are, entire worlds of written information out there in the many languages that use cuneiform, just waiting to be uncovered. So, some of the things that these cuneiform inscriptions can really tell us about are, religion, about government, and especially about economics. And, the status of dependent labor and the systems of dependent labor that in many ways fueled the incredible prosperity of southern Mesopotamia. What we see in these texts that give us lists of the names of enslaved people is that they're very often from beyond Mesopotamia. They're very often from the foothills of southern Anatolia, from the Zagros Mountains of what is today northern Iraq. And we also see people being trafficked into southern Mesopotamia as labor. We also see people bound in other types of non-freedom, especially debt bondage, where if you borrowed money, which was a common thing in Mesopotamia, and which was done at interest. It wasn't just like a loan. You had to pay back even more, just like so many of us with our student loans. If you defaulted on that debt and weren't able to pay it back with the stated interest in the stated amount of time, you could become a debt slave. And so the products of your labor would be confiscated by your debtor until the amount of that loan was paid off. And these really large workforces of different varieties of dependent labor seem to have been important parts of both temple and palace labor forces. And just to give you a couple of sort of academic views here, these are both from an article by a scholar named El-Ghazi, who we will see again in the course of this lecture. These tablets that, especially, cuneiform tablets in general, very often, especially in the early periods, record the disbursement of textiles, grain, dairy products, those sorts of things to individuals. And we'll see both in the ancient Near East and in the Aegean during the Bronze Age that these kinds of accounts are often rations or materials, craft materials, paid out to administrators to oversee gangs of either fully or partially dependent workers under their command. So the supplies they need to make fine textiles, the rations for a month or more for the people under their administrative control. And interestingly, El-Ghazi also points out one of the other outcomes of these tablets is that, these are most of the personal names that we have for the earliest Mesopotamian cities and states. And we have the names of well over 400 people at the last bit of scholarship about this that I could find. Well over 400 people. Personal names, and these are the names of slaves rather than their owners. So this is one of the few realms where we know more about the lower classes, even just in terms of their names, than we do about the political and economic elite. So, administration, which comes along with that writing, kingship, the whole system of royalty, of monarchy, is another part of this ideological city, the urbanism of the mind that we see being developed in southern Mesopotamia in this period. One of the places where these ideas of institutional hierarchy and kingship and the relationship between palaces and temples, between secular or at least semi-secular authority and religious authority in Mesopotamia. One of the places where this is laid out is in this object, what's sometimes called the Warka vase, or the Uruk vase, which is a a limestone offering vase. You can see some similar objects up here, that was found in the Ayanna precinct at Uruk, and it's dated somewhere around 3,500 to 2,900. This shows us in these three large registers the sort of basic order of society. At the bottom, divided into two little sub-registers, we've got animals, up here sheep, above plants and water below, kind of the bedrock of society. In the middle, we have ordinary people, worshippers with a variety of offerings for the important, the most high-ranked members of society at the top, the king, and then this figure who is alternately identified. Some people identify her as a goddess, the goddess herself, probably Inanna, who was the main deity at Uruk, or the priestess, or something in between. The priestess actually embodying the deity herself. And then up here we have, a variety of, attendants, both for the king, as well as for the priestess or the goddess herself, or temple staff and temple-based wealth. So, this is the period where we also start to see a variety of different titles and terms for the institution of kingship itself. We see rulers of cities, or the secular rulers of cities, called a variety of things in this period. We see them called ensi, lord of the plowland, lord of the agricultural land. We see very early on this sign N, lord or master, and in this case, this is part of a plaque with the name of Inanna, the goddess, goddess of war and sexuality and turbulence of many sorts. But this is the sign for N. And here we've got it in a very early pictograph of a throne. And here in a later, more abstracted form. And then the other, one of the other titles for a person in charge is Lugal. This is again one of these very early pictographs for Lugal, and then a slightly later cuneiform version. And this is again sometimes king. It's thought that this is a sign of a person perhaps wearing a crown of some sort. And we see cuneiform written in all sorts of different directions. So here horizontally, here vertically. We see other signs of authority that are not titles in this period. We start to see specific clothing associated with people of authority. Early on, these include this net kilt or skirt and rolled hat for early Sumerian leaders, the Ensi here and his acolyte in a much shorter net skirt. This is a broken cylinder seal impression. They seem to be feeding a herd of cattle. And the whole idea of the king as shepherd, the leader as shepherd, has its origins in this period in the ancient Near East, and which is a thing that is seen widely again throughout Mediterranean culture in antiquity afterwards. Slightly later, we start to see these funny, shaggy kind of garments worn by both men and women. They're called kaunakes. The men's version is like, a fleece midi skirt. Doesn't quite come all the way down to the ankles, but comes pretty close. And these are either like heavy, stiff sheepskin, or they may be felted locks of wool, rather than being still attached to a hide. When we see women wearing a kanaukes, it comes up over one shoulder. This is a sculpture of an early king or perhaps local governor of the city of Adab, whose name is Lugal Dalu. It's in limestone, and this was found at a temple in the city of Adab, and Lugal Dalu is in the form of a worshiper, and he's identified. So we've got again this emphasis on the eyes. These hollows would have been filled in with probably some sort of shell or colored stone, sealed in there with bitumen. And then this posture with his hands folded, and this slight little smile and his eyes, fixed, indicate that he is in the process of worshiping the deity whose temple it's set up in this case, the temple of Esar in Adab. But we see these similar sculptures in temples throughout the ancient Near East, especially in southern Mesopotamia. And we know that it's Lugal Dalu because his name is in fact inscribed on his shoulder here in very early cuneiform. Okay, so this is a point where I do need to give a content warning. I'm about to get into some violent death, human remains, human sacrifice. Do as you need to take care of yourselves. So another feature of this ideological city, of the creation of kingship and royal power as ideas, is seen in the royal cemetery, the royal tombs at the city of Ur, wherein 16 of the largest, so there are hundreds of graves that were found in this area, near various temples in the city of Ur, and 16 of these graves were particularly large, particularly richly furnished, and several of these also included human sacrifice. So keep in mind, as we're about to see some fairly grisly things in the next few slides. These were excavated in the 1920s and 30s by the archaeologist Leonard Woolley, who worked at Ur well into the 1960s. This was a joint project of the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania. You can, in fact, see many of the most important finds from the royal tombs of Ur in Philadelphia at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology. Over 2,000 graves were found, dated roughly between 2600 and 2000 BC. As I just mentioned on the last slide, 16 of them were especially large. And in some cases, there were cylinder seals and other artifacts found in the tombs that actually give us the names of these occupants. These are usually called royal tombs of one sort or another, although we do not know the names and titles of all of the occupants of these tombs. So these 16 royal tombs also contained the remains of sacrificed animals and human attendants who were arranged in essentially tableaus of very often in the form of a banquet, or in positions with tools that suggest the roles they may have played in service to the main individual in the tomb. As you could probably guess, with excavation in the 20s and 30s. The media coverage of this was pretty spectacular and sensational, grim tragedy of wicked Queen Shupat's 100 poisoned slaves. Yeah. So, speaking of Shubad, or as she's now usually called Puabi, this is one of the most impressive tombs of the royal tombs of Ur. It's technically called Tomb PG 800, PG meaning private grave. Tomb PG 800, where the queen herself was interred in a separate mud brick chamber, and then the ramps of that were carved down into the soil to bring her and her incredible wealth and things like the chariot with its animals still attached to it, the remains of multiple servants, including a musician with a harp, that accompanied her in death. This is not just a thing that is seen in the ancient Near East, by the way. This is also a thing we see in early dynastic Egypt and several other cultures around the world, kind of at this point where they really start to implement monarchies or other sort of highly stratified, almost authoritarian systems of government. So we know her name because of the cylinder seal found in her tomb with the inscription Puabi Nin. Nin is the word for queen, so Queen Puabi. And she was laid to rest in this spectacular array of jewelry. These multiple necklaces, not all of which are shown actually on this dummy from the University of Pennsylvania Museum. But she's got multiple belts of gold and colored stones. She's got this fabulous beaded cape with these like dangling strings of beads, multiple necklaces, these gigantic earrings or sort of temple hair suspended hoops, and these like ribbons of gold that were wrapped around her hair, and several headdresses on top of her head, including this one with this halo of stars that would have like bobbed as she walked. This is very, very thin gold leaf that many of these ornaments are made out of. The other tomb that I want to discuss is tomb PG 1237. Unfortunately, the actual burial chamber for the sort of focal individual was never found in this tomb. It does, however, contain the largest number of sacrificed individuals, and is sometimes called the Great Death Pit. You can, again, imagine the kind of sensation this made in the 1920s and 30s when this was, announced to the public. So the far left, we have the plan, Woolley's original plan from the 1930s, showing the positions of all 78, I think, individuals found in this tomb. This is also the source of some of the most famous pieces of early dynastic Mesopotamian art. Things like the ram in a thicket sculpture with this ram carved out of multiple kinds of stone put together with bitumen, gilded legs, lapis lazuli horns, in this, gold leaf tree. The multiple lyres, so kinds of harps, this one made out of silver, in fact, and other, really important and famous works of art. Which of you have taken an intro to art history class, you may have in fact seen. More recent scholarship on this tomb and others from the royal tombs of Ur has actually focused much more on the individuals who accompanied these members of the highest Mesopotamian elite into the afterlife, and leveraging modern forensic techniques, modern scientific imaging and analysis techniques to tell us more about these particular individuals. So as it happens, in the 1930s excavations of these tombs, in a few cases, Leonard Woolley, the excavator, actually used hot wax to consolidate the entire assemblage around some of these individuals, in this case the head of the young woman who's known just as Body 52. Body 52 is, let's see if I can find her on the map. It's 55. Here we go. Number 52, right here in the middle. So Woolley consolidated these in one piece with hot wax. So he was able to lift all of this as it was laid in the tomb, as it was placed in the tomb, as a single block, and then from the back, this was all set into plaster, so it could be displayed as it was in situ. That's the INSITU, in situ. That's the fancy archaeological term for in place, as it displayed as it was in place. So, in 2007, two of these sets of skeletal remains were actually investigated with a variety of different imaging techniques, X-rays, CT scans, and with the remains that are now in the UK, with other kinds of forensic analysis, as a way of investigating one of the long-standing questions about these tombs, which is how did they get people to agree to this? The actual end of the lives of individuals as a statement of the power and authority of these rulers is pretty staggering. And there have been, starting with the original coverage and the original interpretations of the excavators in the 1930s, a variety of theories that these people may have voluntarily poisoned themselves, that they walked themselves down into the death pits and arranged themselves in these tableaus while they were still alive, and then they all drank poison, or because some of these were found with cups next to them, or that they were the other major theory being that they were killed elsewhere and then arranged after death. We know from cuneiform literary sources that that the funerals of important leaders in this period were multi-day affairs, and so these are the question of did people go down there on their own, of their own free will, or were they preserved somehow after death and then laid out so as to withstand the multiple days of funeral rituals, is an ongoing one. However, it seems that we have, at least for these two individuals, pretty good evidence that both of the skulls that were investigated with CT scans and X-rays show fatal blunt force trauma, circular holes radiating fractures, probably caused by a small but very heavy warhammer or picked, a pointed tool. So they were appear to have died before the burial rather than, taking a sedative or poison at the time of the burial. And this one, Body 52, also during the X-ray and CT investigations, showed the bones showed signs of being heated or smoked immediately after death, probably as a way of preserving them. And also, up here, you see these little speckles. Researchers noticed these tiny deposits of something metallic in the sort of overall assemblage. And a couple of different kinds of testing confirmed that this is mercury sulfide, which can be found in a kind of rock called cinnabar. It makes this intense red, but it's also one of the most easily available sources of mercury in the pre-industrialized world. And so it seems that this cinnabar, this source of mercury, was actually burned on the same fire that was used to smoke or at least partially dry the body of this individual. This is the earliest known use of mercury sulfide for embalming, and in fact one of the earliest known sort of deliberate chemical embalmings in the world. Before the results of this study, the earliest known use of mercury sulfide for embalming was in 1st century AD China. So, okay, let's move on to something that's a little less grisly. Another facet of this ideological city, of the sort of mental constructs of urbanism, isn't just one-sided, potentially fatal royal authority. It's also cities working together. And from this early period, from the Jemdet Nasser period in particular, but also from the early dynastic period, we see a few very particular seals that seem to involve the names of multiple cities in southern and central Mesopotamia. These seal impressions have been found in multiple different cities. The seals themselves are quite large, unusually large. Most cylinder seals are only about the size of the first joint of your pinky finger. So they're tiny. But these are quite large. They're, let's say, index finger size. And they contain the signs for multiple cities. So Uruk here, Nippur, Larsa, Ur. Other ones that we won't hear about at other points in this class, Zabala, Kuara, Kutha. These seem to be, and they seal documents that are essentially lists of commodities, grain, fish, fruit, etc. They seem to suggest some kind of regional trade partnership or regional alliance between these cities, with this seal as the sort of symbol of their general agreement. So the Great Seal of the United Nations could be used in a similar way to, as a sign of the, joint agreement of all members of the United Nations. This may be, a tiny version of the United Nations from ancient Mesopotamia. On a smaller scale, we also see that some village institutions seem to have carried over into cities. We have plenty of evidence, and I've just got one instance here of a story about Gilgamesh. The tablets that we have of it are from the 2nd millennium BC, but it may be referring to events from, the middle 2000s or even earlier. And this is a city council, so we see a variety of references to different kinds of semi-representative bodies among the citizens of cities. So in this case, the elders of his city. He's trying to go to war. Gilgamesh of Uruk is trying to go to war with Aga, the king of Kish, who has insulted him, and so he puts this issue before the elders of his city, and he says, we're going to make better wells, and then because Kish wanted Uruk's water, and we're gonna make better wells, and then we're gonna go beat the crap out of the city of Kish. We should not submit to the house of Kish. Let us smite it with weapons. So this is just one of several different kinds of semi-representative bodies that seem to also be involved in the governance of these Mesopotamian city-states. Okay, so Uruk is one of the earliest cultures, the Uruk culture of southern Mesopotamia. So all of these guys as kind of a cultural unity are one of the first cultures we can see really as a widespread phenomenon. So these city-states had little wars against each other, but we also see material culture and architecture and social institutions like the Uruk culture catching on often at a slightly later date, elsewhere in the Fertile Crescent, all the way up to southern Anatolia, far north at a place called Arslan Tepe, which we will not look at in great detail, but which is, a long way from, say, Eridu. So this is often called the Uruk expansion. This has been described in many different ways, as a physical expansion, as a proto-empire, as a purely cultural expansion, as an economic empire, and we're going to look at some of the ways that this spread and some of the responses to that. So one of these places that is part of the Uruk expansion is this settlement called Tepe Guara. This is another tell site. If you remember that one of those other words for tell is tepe. This is especially interesting and important in the 13th through 11th phases of the site, where we have architecture that both uses elements of the Uruk culture and also responds to elements of the Uruk culture. And, this really brings us around to larger questions. What does it mean for a culture to spread? How do archaeologists track that? How closely do material culture and government and the ways that people live actually interact? What do seeing specific pieces of material culture in specific patterns actually tell us about the relationships between communities in particular places? There are many things that are, bigger and more encompassing than just one, what specific things happened at one specific place that we can learn about from the archaeology of places like Tepe Guara. So, since I talked in detail about Tepeguara and those phases of the site where Mesopotamian-style temples seem to have, been burnt down and then replaced by that unusual, very local round fortification. I'm not going to repeat that from the last lecture, but I do urge you guys to go, review that at this point as like one instance of the Uruk expansion that may not have, may not have gone over so well. So the question now is actually a more general one. How do we know? How do we know that the Uruk culture expanded and, as some scholars argue, sent out colonies or had trading outposts or, what kind of evidence? It comes in many forms. So one of those pieces of evidence is the presence of accounting. Numerical tablets, cylinder seals, kinds of record keeping that, are similar to the kinds of record keeping we see in southern Mesopotamia, but which also interact and respond to the cultures of seal use that I talked about in northern Mesopotamia much earlier on. So there's already an indigenous tradition of seal use, and we see changes both to how seals and accounting were adopted in Uruk expansion settlements, as well as in indigenous contexts at this time. There are also changes in pottery, both in terms of specific forms and ways of using pottery, like these beveled rim bowls that I've mentioned a couple times in this class, that seem to have been standardized rations, so mass-produced bowls in standard sizes used for rations for laborers, whether that was, grain porridge or bread or any number of other things. It's not just the bowl itself that these bowls these bowls communicate to modern scholars. It's also they also suggest the adoption of this system of standardized rations for labor that was common in southern Mesopotamia. We also see changes in pottery techniques. In many parts of northern Mesopotamia, it was very common to use vegetable material, chaff or straw, to change the qualities of clay before it's fired, so that it holds together better or is lighter. In some of these Uruk expansion communities, we see changes in pottery techniques. So alongside those indigenous vegetable-tempered styles of pottery, we may also see mineral-tempered clay, like was used in southern Mesopotamia. So the clay itself is local, but the potters are adding adding extra materials to change the properties of the clay in ways that are similar to what's done in the south of the region. And this suggests movements of craftspeople, so actual potters who learned how to make pots down here, moving far to the north. And also, over time, the spread of craft traditions. So those potters from the south teaching people in the north, their way of making pottery. And then we also see some architectural forms that are also characteristic of the south, spreading up to northern Mesopotamia. These include those tripartite buildings that have been mentioned at Ur and Uruk and at Tepeguara, like in the last lecture. Also, those like heavily buttressed surfaces that help mud brick walls stand up taller, and also those clay and cone mosaics that I mentioned earlier in this lecture. So at this point, thinking about scholarship of the ancient Near East in general, what scholars are really trying to do is like reconcile the big patterns that they see of, you know, the Uruk culture spreading to the north and to the east, and you know what that means versus what we can see on the ground in terms of archaeology, because this Uruk expansion happened in multiple different ways in different places at different times. And so, you know, these big patterns versus what we can see of local agency and local choices. How do we describe that? How do we make a big narrative out of these individual and very diverse situations? So, for example, let me give you some examples. Far to the north, actually, no, I'm sorry, I'm going to start down here at Susa, because this is the Uruk expansion seems to have happened first in the east, in the area of the greater area around the city of Susa, and then slightly later happened in the north. So I'm going to start down here at Susa, and I'm going to go counterclockwise. So at Susa, we see the adoption of, early on in the Uruk expansion, we see cylinder seals with scenes of everyday life, things like people weaving or people with animals. And we also see the intensive use of administrative tablets. So these are elements that they seem to have borrowed, whether through people from southern Mesopotamia moving east, or through adoption of like specific pieces, specific cultural practices. Slightly later, a little further to the north and up in the hills, at this place called Godin-Tepe, we actually see material culture, seals and sealing practices that is similar to both Uruk and to Susa. So we have here not just like some sort of one-way transmission with the people of Godin-Tepe adopting things from southern Mesopotamia and nowhere else. We see multiple points of origin for some of these cultural changes. And, you know, this is a choice by the community and, you know, speaks to what kinds of places they may have been in contact with, what priorities they may have had. And this is, you know, this really complicates earlier ideas of the Uruk expansion being like a one-way thing with the civilization of southern Mesopotamia moving in one direction out to the greater hinterland, the periphery of the larger Fertile Crescent. So let's go further here to the north. At the site of Hamukar, again, one of the first signs that we see is extensive cylinder seal use. And this is in, you know, early on. In fact, at the very early part of the Uruk period in general, we see, you know, a comparable level of seal use at Hamukar as to southern Mesopotamia. We see the site of Hamukar in close cultural connection with its neighbor to the west, Tel Brak, which I will talk about a lot more in the next part of this lecture, taking on this particular religious practice of these idols that I think look like E.T., if you've seen that old movie from the 80s. I'll talk a lot more about this in a bit. However, we also see completely independent things, such as the importation of obsidian from the far west, from far to the north of Hamukar in what is today Western Anatolia. Um, in a source from a source of obsidian at a place called Mount Nemrut, up here close to the Black Sea, which is a sign of an independent trade network with southern Anatolia. And then this sort of intermediate, possibly Uruk influenced, possibly not, period comes to an end with a violent destruction around 3500 BC. So signs of burning, buildings destroyed, all of those sorts of things I've talked about earlier. That's followed by phases of the site that are very close to the Uruk culture from southern Mesopotamia. Okay, so following around here to the west, here at the far north of the Uruk expansion, the site of Arslan Tepe, in Turkey itself now, there we see a couple of things around 3400 BC. We see a palace built with very close similarities to the palaces of Ur and Uruk, and a sudden appearance of Sumerian-style pottery alongside local pottery styles. So this was a pre-existing community that all of a sudden we see either the influx of people from southern Mesopotamia or the adoption by the local elite of architectural styles from southern Mesopotamia alongside the importation of pottery. But that palace was like, like we saw at Tepe Guara. That palace only lasted for a couple of hundred years, and it seems to have been destroyed around 3200. And there is a phase with only local pottery styles for over a century at Arslan Tepe before there is again a return of Sumerian-style pottery, but we think not a direct connection with southern Mesopotamia. We think that Sumerian-style pottery, based on other archaeological evidence from the site, that it's actually a closer connection with this area of northern Mesopotamia, where, like at the site of Habuba Kabira, there are several Sumerian-style cities that were founded completely from scratch, completely new. So, coming around to this last bit of, big patterns and local agency, at the site of Habuba Kabira in what is today eastern Syria, this seems to be a Sumerian-style city that was planned completely from scratch. It was founded from new on a site that had never been occupied. It has very regular orthogonal streets. It's got a central temple. It's got all sorts of signs that this was, essentially an idealized Sumerian city picked up and just dropped into this place in northern Mesopotamia. And it really, in the grand scheme of things, did not last for very long, because it only occupied for about 120 years before it was abandoned. So there are many different trajectories and many different strategies that we see employed between, possible immigrants from southern Mesopotamia who may have left for a variety of reasons, and many communities in the outlying areas that made their own choices and made their own culture in response to or alongside the culture from southern Mesopotamia. Okay, That is it for this part of the lecture. It has been very long. I'm breaking this up into 2 other parts. So join me next time when I talk about alternate forms of urbanism in late prehistory.